Hey guys, welcome to Future Thinkers Podcast, episode number 43. This is the second half of our interview with Daniel Schmachtenberger, who is the co-founder of Neurohacker Collective. In this half, we talk about the process of neurogenesis, which parts of ancient wisdom are useful in modern society, therapeutic use of psychedelics, and rites of passage, and many other fascinating things.
For all the links, mentions, and books from this episode, go to futurethinkers.org/43. And to listen to the first half, go to futurethinkers.org/42. And if you haven't listened to our other episode with Daniel Schmachtenberger, in which we talk about the global phase shift we may be going through, go to futurethinkers.org/36. And if you're interested in trying Qualia, the smart drug stack that Daniel's company has developed, go to futurethinkers.org/brainhack. All one word. Before we get into this episode, I want to say thank you to our recent patrons and donors, Christian, Pablo, and Richard. You guys are awesome. Thank you for helping us make this show possible. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome to futurethinkers.org, a podcast about the evolution of technology, society, and consciousness. I'm Mike Gilliland.
And I'm Yuvia Ivanova.
To get notified of new podcasts and videos, go to futurethinkers.org and subscribe to our mailing list. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube.
If you like what we do and you want to help us make more podcasts and videos, give us a like or a review, share it with your friends, and consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/futurethinkers. If you're looking to get serious about meditation, check out the meditation app that we've created with Vinay Gupta called The Cutting Machinery. Go to cuttingmachinery.org/app.
Last but not least, if you want to get access to more content, hidden episodes, or if you just want to chat with us and previous guests, then check out our community at community.futurethinkers.org. I'd like to go back to neurogenesis and maybe talk again about some of the more specific treatments that support neurogenesis. And I'm also wondering, is this work mostly being done in the space of Alzheimer's treatment?
No. Neurogenesis is a fascinating field, adult neurogenesis in particular, because, up until not that long ago, it was commonly believed that we didn't generate new neurons after adulthood. And that's not true. It's why neurogenesis is so fascinating. Our brain does continuously produce neural stem cells, mostly in the hippocampus, that then differentiate into, other regions of the brain, other tissues. And that rate of neural stem cell production can be increased or decreased by a number of factors. So when we think about brain aging, and also neurogenesis isn't just for brain aging, it's also for dealing with traumatic brain injury and the ability to actually heal areas of brain that were damaged. It has to do with increasing gray matter density and just increasing the total information processing capacity of the system. Also dealing with, nerve damage, peripheral nerve damage, or neurodegeneration. A researcher on our team just wrote a meta-analysis of all of the research done on adult neurogenesis, and we'll be publishing it soon. And it's fascinating. And our hypothesis from an evolutionary biology perspective is that when you think about human genetics and what they selected for more than anything, they selected for, this is a generalized but fair way to say it, they selected for neurogenesis. Our genes selected for memes, right? They selected for a creature that could change themselves and their basis for acting over the course of their life significantly and one generation to the next faster than genes could change. And so most animals, their behavior is pretty genetically hardwired and modulated by the environment a little, which is why they actually have the hardwired code to get up and walk and do stuff in the first few minutes of life. And we are neotenous and basically useless for so long, right? For a year and a half, we can't do hardly anything. And it's because we're very soft wired. Because as tool makers that modify our own environment, think about the most adaptive person 10,000 years ago at spear throwing would be useless today because they couldn't text and they couldn't type and they wouldn't know how to call an Uber. And so it's very important that as we are modifying the environment, we can adapt to our new modified environments, which means that we are not hardwired, that we can be rewiring our innate processes, right? And neurogenesis is a major part of that. So it's a super fascinating field for disease recovery, for anti-aging, for understanding human nature, and for kind of hyper learning and capabilities. So there's a bunch of things that affect neurogenesis. There are these chemicals called neurotrophins, which basically upregulate neuron production. BDNF is the most well understood one, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, NGF for nerve growth factor. So there are things that can increase BDNF, increase NGF. And normal lifestyle things like exercise is one of the ones that we know better than anything that actually increases neurogenesis. Weightlifting and HIIT training in particular, more than aerobics, are very BDNF upregulating. Sleep is BDNF upregulating, and lack of sleep ends up meaning decreased neurogenesis. There are a number of nutrients that are also involved, and there are some herbs and mushrooms that have very, very potent effects. So, lion's mane has been used for nerve injury for a long time, and it happens to very acutely elevate NGF levels. Some key nutrients like methylcobalamin, the methylated form of B12, and taurine in fairly high doses upregulate the endogenous rate of neurogenesis. Then there are some drugs that are being developed for neurogenic purposes, and I actually think this is one of the most brilliant things a drug could do. I said some things that sounded like they were negative regarding pharmaceutical approach as a whole earlier. I want to say that some very meaningfully positive things are happening in all branches of pharmaceuticals, largely because other areas, especially in complex disease, are failing. So what's the cool new areas that are happening is not just a chemical that will try and change the level of something, but a drug that will actually support the body's ability to do something better. So that I can make this point well, think about a statin, right, for cholesterol. If your cholesterol is high and we give you a statin to lower it, we don't know why your cholesterol is high. Your cholesterol can be high because of diet. It can be high because of diabetes-like things. It can be high because of mold toxicity. And so just lowering it doesn't actually address the pathology or the behavior or the whatever. So that kind of drug approach is not that interesting. And very interestingly, sometimes the opposite is what needs to happen. So we can, if your blood pressure is high and we give you a drug to just lower your blood pressure, all right, you just exogenously lowered blood pressure. But why had the body been setting that point too high to begin with? If you exercise, the reason that exercise lowers blood pressure is because when you exercise, it raises your blood pressure. And when the blood pressure spikes even higher, it actually kicks in the hormetic mechanisms. Hormesis is the body's response to stress. It kicks in the hormetic mechanism for the body to say, oh, the blood pressure is too high, let's bring it down on our own. And the body starts regulating blood pressure better, but it actually, rather than externally moving it lower, what it needed was to be moved higher, and then its own self-regulation occurred. So drugs that just try and move something into range without asking why it happened and without increasing the body's ability to maintain that range, not so interesting to me. Even though, they're life-saving, they're just not adequate solutions as we move forward. But as we move from like the chemotherapeutic approaches to cancer to immuno-oncology, immuno-oncology is the beginning of us doing anything with cancer that's really interesting, where we're actually training the body's immune system's capacity to kill cancer cells better. That's actually pretty great. Well, in the neurologic space, there's a company called Neuralstem. They're working on a drug. They're in, I believe, phase 2 clinical trials right now called NSI 189. And it was originally being developed for ALS, but now I believe that the first thing that they're trying to approve it for is major depressive disorder. But for ALS, they were originally working with neural stem cells. They would grow neural stem cells and shoot them up into the spinal cord, either where there was spinal cord injury or neurodegeneration like ALS. And they were getting some results, and they wanted to say, well, could we increase the body's rate of producing its own neural stem cells? So they were growing neural stem cells in vitro and seeing if there were any molecules that would increase their own proliferation. They found some that did, and NSI 189 was the primary one. So here, it's a drug that isn't trying to modulate an in-chain chemical. It's actually upregulating your body's own regulatory process. And once you have those new neural stem cells, they keep doing their thing, right? They become tissues and they do their regulatory thing. Now, if you think about if that drug continues to succeed, I don't know if it will, but there will be a whole class of ones like that. It could fix nerve damage from injury, nerve damage from neuropathy. It could fix retinopathy. It could fix MS, ALS, Parkinson's. And the reason why it was working in depression was as they were getting upregulated production of new stem cells in the hippocampus, and then that's starting to affect the surrounding basal structures, the person actually had more information processing capacity to process their emotions and process their experiences, and they didn't get overwhelmed and get depressed by them. There's a company called ZingUp. They have a website, zingup.com, and they originally developed, a friend of mine over there developed it, a set of processes that they were trying to bring about for helping autism. And then what they figured out, they ended up applying to just performance enhancement. So right now it's a performance enhancement site. But they found that there were, you actually really dig this, there were movement patterns that more than other movement patterns radically upregulated neural stem cell production, and specifically were growing gray matter density in the cerebellum, hippocampus, pons, mostly cerebellum.
Wow.
And that autism was getting better, depression was getting better. They did a study in prisons and violence went down because when people are overwhelmed by the amount of stimulus coming in, their emotions, et cetera, and they can't process it all, then the results of the not processed stuff is lingering anxiety, depression, confusion, and just being able to process it better physiologically led to, the healthier, happier people. And so how they found to do it, I think this is a kind of profound insight, was when you first start doing some kind of coordination activity, like riding a bike or walking on a slack line or juggling, that you've never done, at first it seems almost like it's impossible. Like you can't even find the place where it makes sense that will be possible because you don't have the neural circuitry to do that particular kind of balance, sensory motor coordination stuff yet. And then as soon as you start to get it, you're like, okay, I'm not nowhere near perfect yet, but I have the hang, like there's something inside of me that knows how to do this. Going from the I have no idea how to do this up to getting the hang of it, there is a rapid rate of the production of new neural stem cells that are saying, whoa, we're actually in danger because we can't do this physical activity that's obviously, needs to happen. Let's upregulate our capacity like crazy to be able to do it. Once you can do it, and now you're just getting better at doing it, you get a diminishing return on that. And so what they figured out to do was how to take people through a series of exercises, and they customized them based on assessment. But in general, anyone could do this, a series of exercises that involved coordination and balance and coordinating multiple sensory motor groups that were super difficult. And as soon as you started to get the hang of it, they switched and did a new one. And then as soon as you started to get the hang of it, they switched and did a new one. So you were maximizing for the growth rate of neurogenesis, which then ended up having an effect on, all kinds of other things. The hypothesis there was that it has to do with automating learning. So we learn some, we start learning some motor function, and it's very hard, and we're trying to think about where our hands go and where our feet go and all these things at once, and we can't think about that many things consciously. So our brain has to try to get some of them in unconscious memory, and then we can drive a stick shift without even thinking about it, when at first it seems like 7 different hard things to coordinate. In an evolutionary environment, us moving stuff from conscious to unconscious, right? Consciously, we're trying to learn some new skills. Now we can unconsciously perform it. We would have done that for motor tasks more than anything else. And cognitive and language, et cetera, tasks kind of came evolutionarily on top of that. So our capacity to learn new stuff, motor tasks are going to be able to drive that evolutionary hardware more specifically, right? That was their hypothesis, and it seems to be well supported by the evidence. And so if you do a bunch of sensory motor tasks that you can't do it all, and then you start to be able to do them, and you do a bunch of different ones, you're actually increasing kind of the neural infrastructure for the rate of learning and automating conscious to unconscious performance. And then that same infrastructure is used when you are learning cognitive tasks or interpersonal skills or anything else. So the idea was that it would increase rate of learning, and they've got a bunch of research showing that happens to be the case. So that's another example of a methodology approach, right? So you've got drug approaches, nutrition approaches, exercise approaches, methodology approaches for neurogenesis.
That is fascinating. I think that explains in plain terms how yoga works and how yoga actually supports brain development just through doing a series of different complex movements.
Totally. I would say yoga is probably a combination of that effect that we just mentioned, along with the stress relieving effects and some of the effects of increased breath, both increased breath on parasympathetic function and on oxygen, carbon dioxide levels.
Very cool. What are some of the other areas that are important to talk about? So now to summarize, we've talked about the gut brain, the emotional regulation, we've talked about movement, systems approaches to measuring and understanding what is going on in your body before you're going to go and mess with it. What are some other areas of neurohacking that are really important pillar areas?
We didn't talk about altered states of consciousness yet.
All right.
Just waiting for that one.
So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, psychedelic-assisted spirituality, psychedelic-assisted neural repatterning. Super fascinating field. And, even though that field started with, people like Stanislav Grof, et cetera, back in the day, it has been accelerating a lot recently, and I'm very happy to see this. When I think about the role of psychedelics, entheogens in human development, I think about three kind of distinct categories. You can use it as a personal development tool. You can use it as an interpersonal tool and as a transpersonal tool. So as a personal tool, we can talk about, the role in addiction recovery. So you've seen the results of ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT being used along with psychotherapeutic processes for addiction recovery for people on opiates, on benzos, on all kinds of things. And it's a fascinating field. It shares some things with ketamine's approach to depression, but so you can look at addiction recovery, work with PTSD, with end-of-life anxiety. These are areas where it seems to be having an effect that is either more than or different than any other therapies. And so very fascinating. This is for working on pathology. For just more kind of psychotherapeutic growth, the role that psychedelics can play in shadow work and integrating parts of self is really fascinating. When you realize that we don't remember, when we're remembering memories, we don't remember the memory, we remember how it's consolidated in our brain, factoring all the times we've remembered it and changed it. That's a big insight, because it means that if you can re-remember a memory and remember it quite differently, you can actually affect how it was stored and all the future times it will be referenced. And so say someone is on MDMA, and so they're in a pretty euphoric state, and then they think about some negative experience of their past, but they can't feel negative while they think about it. So it would always be in the past that they would think about it and feel negative, right? They had that associative conditioning. Now they're thinking about it and feeling great. So that means that the regions of the brain and the chemistry that's involved in feeling great and that specific thought are co-wiring together. And then the next time when this person is sober and they think about it, they remember the last way they remembered it, and it doesn't have that same charge that it used to have for them. This can be about a traumatic memory of the past. It can also be thinking about parts of themselves that they're ashamed of or can't love or whatever. And instantly, like in a fairly short amount of time, one or a small number of sessions, radically change the charge around psychological topics.
This is something I've been really interested in and thinking about, and partially why I brought up the whole idea of the gut brain and asking your gut how you feel about something, because I'm trying to separate how I feel and what I think about memories and about how I look into the future. So this has been an extremely useful tool for me, because I separate the memory into its two components and then process the emotions on their own so that I don't have to continue feeling negatively about an event. And this has worked really well.
Because you have the memory of just what happened, and then you have all the meaning making around it. And the meaning making can change while you still remember the event that happened. And when the meaning making changes, the somatics and the emotions can change accordingly, right? So you experience some event in childhood and the meaning was something about that you're a failure and you should never try stuff and whatever. And when you reprocess and say, actually, that's not a realistic meaning. I was a kid and, I've actually done well at those things later, et cetera. You can still remember the event, but it doesn't have the same associated meaning about self and about reality. So then it doesn't have the same charge, the fear charge that's trying to protect you from that painful possibility in the future, et cetera. You can do that without psychedelics. Psychedelics just happen to be one very fast way to change that association.
Yeah, I think psychotherapy is another one, and also hypnotherapy, because you can induce somebody into trance and then re-imprint a certain experience so that, exactly like you were saying, the processing of it changes, how your brain processes that.
So when you talk about hypnotherapy and inducing trance, if we're going to try and change the way that someone has stored a memory or change their association with a phobia or whatever it is, then we want to get them into a state that is amenable to change, right? Psychedelics are a good way of doing this, largely because they actually increase neuroplasticity. So we talked about neurogenesis, developing new neurons, but developing new synapses and cleaving old synapses might be even more meaningful, which is what in the brain interconnects with what. So old synapses that are no longer relevant get cleaved mostly during deep sleep by microglia, and then new synapses get developed. It's called synaptogenesis through the learning process. So like that zing up example, as you go from can't find it at all to find it, that's the process of synaptic formation. And then healthy synapses that are doing something effective get re-supported through something called the long-term potentiation process that says, yes, this is still a good synapse and we want it to keep operating automatically, so let's keep strengthening it. So one of the things many psychedelics do from a neurophysiologic point of view is increase neuroplasticity. That's one of our best understandings of one of the things that's happening. And that would mean increased ability to actually change neurostructural associations with whatever you do next. So if that's the case, it would make a lot of sense why when someone has a bad trip, it can be so lastingly hard for them. And when someone has a really powerful trip, it can be so permanently changing for them, is because what was happening during that time was having more net impact on their brain than is usually capable of happening per unit time.
Right. Interesting.
So psychedelics can do that. Breath work, right? Like the holotropic breath work can create a state of increased susceptibility. You can use strobe lights to try and drive specific brainwave patterns. Sleep deprivation creates increased susceptibility, which is, a technique that militaries use and even like some conferences use. Yeah, so I would say in general, different forms of psychotherapy are trying to change our information processing, change our meaning making, our somatics, our emotion. When you start to work on the brain side and the psyche side together, you can get synergistically compounding effects. So think about this. This is a fun example. If you do psychedelics and then you are in a set or setting that is not appropriate and you end up just freaking out, and then you kind of wire that you're unsafe in a dangerous universe, that's lame, right? Which is why set and setting and
super lame
can matter. Which is the difference between just tripping and actually doing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or personal development. But if you take psychedelics, and so now imagery is very intense, well, you can do better guided imagery work. And you can be in some image, so you're going to go back and do regression work, think about childhood, but when you're visualizing it, you can actually visualize and it's sensorial and real, so it actually rewires more powerfully, plasticity is increased. And you can even do a microdose, right? A microdose where you're still pretty much sober, but plasticity has increased, which is why people use microdosing when they're going to go learn new athletic capabilities or language or whatever for, just rate of learning of plasticity. Say you microdose, then you do some psychotherapy or EEG neurofeedback or anything that's going to be changing neural patterns. And then afterwards, you do things that chemically increase long-term potentiation and help lock in those new patterns so that they actually stay. That would be like cholinergics, and there's a handful of things that support the long-term potentiation process, but we can just say mostly cholinergics for now. That sequence of things is going to have synergistic value beyond what any of those things have on their own, right? Increase plasticity to change old patterns, put in input to change old patterns to new patterns, put in chemical input to then lock in those new healthy adaptive patterns. So this is just starting to scratch on what interesting neurohacking can look like.
That is fascinating. I mean, this kind of multi-tiered approach to psychedelic therapy as opposed to tripping, like you said.
Right.
I wonder how this relates to the shamanic and initiatory practices of the past, where it was a kind of a multi-tiered approach to this profound consciousness change that they were trying to achieve, where on one hand you have a shaman that is guiding you, then on the other hand you have the herb, the psychoactive ingredient that you're taking, and then on the other hand you have some sort of stress testing, so you have sleep deprivation or physical exertion or facing dangerous environments. And then after the person goes through this, you have the integration practices where everybody hugs and, the person comes back to the tribe, and you kind of have this supportive environment that probably releases some brain chemicals for integrating this experience and retaining it. I wonder how we can take this sort of multi-tier approach and apply it to modern life with better technology.
It's the same as you were mentioning with that. It sounded like yoga had some of the similar properties to what I was saying with the zing up neuroscience. For 250,000 years, we've had, give or take, the same brains as we have now. So there have been smart people around for a long time, right? And as they were paying attention to what worked and didn't work, and then being able to pass that information down over a long period of time, they figured out stuff that worked. And so there's certainly some stuff in the ancient traditions where we've figured out much better stuff. And there's some stuff where their methods are still meaningful in ways where there's nothing in modern life like them. And so obviously the integration of understanding our evolutionary biology and just our biology of the ancient past, understanding what the ancient wisdom cultures figured out that was meaningful, and then being able to not override that, but add to, enhance that with what we know and are growing to know from all of the disciplines of science and advancing technology and exponential technology is a right integrative approach.
So, in your opinion, which aspects of this kind of shamanic initiation practices do we have today that we can enhance with modern technology? And what are the aspects that we have seemingly lost that should be brought back or kept as in the same way that they were doing it before?
All right, well, let's start with things that some wisdom cultures, indigenous cultures had. And I don't want to over-romanticize that their versions of these were perfect or that all cultures had them. There was obviously a whole mix of things. But there's some very meaningful stuff that we have lost that needs to be reincorporated in some way. Rites of Passage is an example. So the rite of passage, there were many different rites of passage that happened, in childhood when a child became self-sufficient. In some ways, there could be a rite of passage to recognize it. Sometimes it got a different name at that point. Rite of passage of puberty and acknowledging what that meant. Our children growing up through puberty are experiencing their interests change, their body change. There's so many things, and we just don't do anything to acknowledge it. And what we do to acknowledge it usually just makes it feel worse, right? We show them videos of gonorrhea and call it sex ed. And all the rites of passage in menopause. I have a friend that is one of the top evolutionary biologists, and he was saying that in his assessment, one of the interesting ways to assess the wisdom of a culture is the role of postmenopausal women in the leadership of that culture. And that women after menopause who can't give birth, who can't make more babies, but who are still wired towards, still have evolutionary wiring towards mothering, have a unique capacity that neither premenopausal women or men have, which is to be able to hold a mothering energy towards the whole. That when you have young kids, it can still be easy to be a little self-centered to you and your kids. But when you don't have young kids anymore, and yet you still have a mothering energy to be able to hold the whole, whether it's the whole tribe or expansively the whole biosphere, etc., So like that's a rite of passage that we mostly just think of as a bummer that, she needs Botox now rather than any meaningful kind of thing. So how we just understand life and the phases of life and the roles, rites of passage, pretty much all of the wisdom cultures did something better than we do. And I don't mean that there was nothing barbaric, but there were some really beautiful things too. That's one example. Another key example was they understood that there was a difference between comfort and happiness. And they understood that happiness oftentimes required beings that were resilient to discomfort. And here's my narrative for this. After the scientific revolution, science was just awesome for so many things. But one of the challenges became, so what's real is what's measurable. And if something isn't measurable, we can't do anything really with it. And comfort was an easier to measure thing than happiness was, right? We could kind of objectively measure how comfortable mattresses were and how good the shock systems in cars were and transport, and be able to measure evolution in those ways. But measuring individual human happiness is a much trickier thing to do. And so you can see how much people have physical comforts now, even just average people, that kings didn't have in the past. And yet we have rampant mental illness that we also didn't have in the past. And one of the interesting things that you notice in most wisdom cultures is that they had practices that intentionally induced meaningful discomfort to teach people to be resilient emotionally to discomfort. So when you think about what a sweat lodge was, or what a vision quest was, or even what hatha yoga is, like yoga, I don't want to say this is all yoga is, but if you just think about yoga through the lens of get in a really awkward pose and then find your breath and find peace, and then get in another really awkward pose and find your breath and find peace, and get bent out of shape in all these different ways, and realize that wherever you are, you can find your breath and find equanimity, find peace. You're actually somatically imprinting that no matter what kind of position you're put into, you can find your breath and find peace in any of them.
That's an amazing insight.
As people learn that their inner state doesn't have to be affected by the environment as much, that leads to more resilient, happy people. As you have people that are only focused on making their environment as comfortable as possible, you can get people who are profoundly unresilient, right, psychologically. So this is another thing that I would say wisdom cultures had that we have largely lost, is the distinction between comfort and happiness, and the importance of optimizing for happiness so that we don't have to actually have a lot of real suffering. You have to actually just induce non-damaging discomfort. That's another example that is just really not part of our wisdom. There are so many things. If you think about the fact that they were all, 150 person tribes, right? Dunbar number tribes. From an attachment theory point of view, you had secure attachment to 150 people. Those people weren't leaving no matter what. And so you didn't grow up and were all alone in the world and try to find all of your secure attachment in one person called a romantic partner, and then completely freak the fuck out if they don't want to be with you, because you actually had really secure attachment across a lot of people. And so, again, modern life, nuclear, family homes, private balance sheets, people are very lonely and very disconnected and very overwhelmed and trying to meet their social and connection and attachment needs in way too few of places. So we could do a whole show on what aspects of indigenous wisdom need reincorporated in the modern world without regressing, right? We're not talking about giving up technology. We are talking about reincorporating some things that were lost in the transition to a new kind of world structure that is different and better than either modern or pre-modern.
Right. And so on the other side of the spectrum, what are the things that the ancient cultures figured out that we can actually do better or enhance with currently available technology?
So many things. So, for instance, let's take Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine or any ancient system of medicine. They were developed in a time, in a place with some people, right? And so even if they were amazing at that time, they were going to apply to the genetics of those people and the kinds of things in their environment and the health issues they faced. So for instance, I happen to have celiac, right? Genetic predisposition to severe gluten intolerance. I had some pretty severe gut issues. I didn't know what it was about when I was about 18. I went to see some of the top Ayurvedic doctors in the world, and they had helped a lot of people I knew. They saved my mom's life when medical doctors had diagnosed her terminal. They'd done great things, but they diagnosed me with a Vata disorder, which was, the worldview that they see through. And so one of the things that I needed were heavy foods, and they gave me as an example chapatis, flatbreads with a lot of oil. Well, the flatbreads were made of wheat, and they would have killed me if I was eating lots of them. But there was no such thing as Indians with gluten intolerance. It was a genetic thing that was outside of that whole worldview, right? And simultaneously, if we start looking at heavy metal exposure or exposure to plastics or PCBs or styrenes or phthalates or, pesticides, all the kinds of toxic exposure we have that can affect cancer, neurodegenerative, endocrine issues, the ancient systems aren't going to know what to do with those things because they weren't part of their environment. So I would say, knowing what the genome is kind of a big deal. Having clinical chemistry, being able to do imaging, these are really big deals. We don't die from infectious disease for the most part, acute infectious disease anymore, because just hygiene and antibiotics and like that actually serve a role in medicine. Painkillers, it's important that people can endure pain, discomfort sometimes to have emotional resilience, but painkillers for dentistry are pretty awesome, compared to not. Simultaneously, we can say, following Weston Price's stuff, that the indigenous people didn't need as much dentistry before they got Western diet. That's also true. But there are heaps of places where we have, let's even take EEG neurofeedback. There are many Buddhist monks who went and worked with neurofeedback and found two things. One, they found that students could get trained to go into certain states of experience much faster with the neurofeedback than they could with just traditional Buddhist practice. And they even found that some of the very advanced Buddhist meditators got insights about their meditation that they hadn't had in decades previously. So, I don't think almost any of us would say, all right, let's trade and go live in indigenous culture, even though there's so many upsides, right? Because there's also so many upsides to modern technological life. But to be able to advance and integrate both is a great thing.
Along the lines of rites of passage that you brought up earlier, I think some of the basic ones, like the rites of passage to become an adult, becoming a teenager, are pretty obvious. But what would you say that are, in the context of our modern technology and world, would be a good idea to create as a new rite of passage? For example, the day you're allowed to use your cell phone or something, being a cultural thing to be using social media in a responsible and effective way that's, you're not addicted to notifications and that sort of thing.
I would say it is a great inquiry for us to think about. The rites of passage did have a lot to do with both making sure someone was prepared for a certain kind of responsibility and predisposing them to handle it well. And so as we have the technological capacity to be more affected by our tech and to affect more in the world through our tech, we both need to build the tech better itself. So, Tristan Harris and others are talking a lot about how we're building tech that is actually really mostly bad for humans, right? That is optimizing blue screen, clickbait, dopamine addiction for people with really shitty attention spans and distraction issues. And we actually need to build the tech differently itself, because again, this is a gaming mechanics thing. If I'm focused on how do I get the most number of clicks and the most time on site, that's not going to make the happiest people, right? And the happiest people are going to come do their shit and then probably leave and do different kinds of behavior that are not focused on driving, clicking on ads. So if I learn how to hijack their dopamine opioid response, this is a bad thing. So part of it is that we actually just have to develop the technology differently. And again, that gets back into the theory of incentives, right? So just like with the pharmaceuticals, if the incentives of the tech developers are not exactly aligned with the well-being of the people that the tech is being developed for, we're going to get a deep mismatch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anywhere that incentive and well-being is misaligned, that externality gap is a problem. And with exponential tech capacity, that externality gap becomes a catastrophic problem. But I think also preparing people to handle the responsibility of tech better is a meaningful part of it. And so I would be very curious to see what the rites of passage in the future might look like.
This is why blockchain has become such an interesting thing for us, because it's a different way of looking at building these technologies while removing the incentives to optimize for a single entity, for example, clickbait, time on site, that sort of thing. So I picture using the blockchain to develop an operating system for a phone that would be open source, and people could develop something like maybe making ad block and that sort of thing native to the phone.
Right.
And then, building in a whole operating system around this principle of we're going to make it better for the human. And then I also picture having sort of the rites of passage and rituals built into that operating system too.
Right. So now let's expand this one step, and I'll say the big picture of how I think about neurohacking is everything in your environment is affecting you, right? This concept of ontological design, that we build environments and they in turn affect us. Like, that's the fascinating thing, is that natural selection is creatures that are being selected for based on their adaptiveness to an environment, but we're the first creature that radically changes its environment, even one generation to the next. But then we're making an environment that is in turn affecting us back. And since we can't genetically change that fast, we are, neurostructurally changing, epigenetically changing. And so when you think about everything, right, you think about the color and the contrast on your phone, you think about the fact that it's two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional, you think about just how much time we spend looking at a fixed focal distance, on our laptop or whatever, and that's a big part of why we lose our eyesight, because our eyes are spending too much time looking at a fixed focal distance rather than having a continuously changing focal distance, part of our evolutionary environment. But you move from that to even thinking about, okay, so we're in a house where the paint is filled full of volatile organic compounds, and the carpet is made out of shit with volatile organic compounds, aldehydes and et cetera, that are either endocrine disruptors, carcinogens, or neurotoxins, and our indoor air quality is worse than freeway air quality. We need to completely change the building materials we use, right? And then you think, well, so those indigenous people spent very little time indoors. So one of the effects was that they didn't have a ceiling above their head most of the time, right? And so they looked up at the sky a lot. If you're in an 8-foot ceiling, you just don't look up a lot. The actual neurologic effect of your eyes going up and your head going up stimulates your brain in different ways that are involved in the creative process and awe and et cetera. So everything from like the physical structure of our buildings to the structure of our digital spaces to colors to chemistry, of houses, of the entire built world, we're building it for a very small number of metrics, right? Like how many cubic feet can we enclose, how cheaply, et cetera. But when we start thinking about that it's all affecting the humans inside, and we say, well, how would I build a house where my primary metric was optimizing the enlightenment and well-being of the human that was inside, along with the well-being of the environment?
Oh, I love this. I wish you could see Yuvi's face while you're talking right now. It's just fireworks.
But now ask the question about how do we rebuild the entire human-built world to optimize for the thriving of all life, right? To optimize for the psychology and the physiology of all the humans and the non-human life, and have a built world that reflects the design integrity of the natural world. When you look at in nature, a hand is optimizing for 1 million functions at a time. It's not optimizing for a few, right? And it's also optimizing for its own adaptive capacity to do so many things. If we start to understand what the difference between complex and complicated systems and learn how to actually grow complex systems, right? How to do complex system design, where we're designing across a lot more parameters. I actually think that's a fair way to think about what humanity's task today is. It's to rebuild all of civilization from scratch, meaning our monetary incentives, our social status systems, our houses, our digital environment, the physical infrastructure, all of it, to rebuild it all from scratch, aligned with thinking about all of its effects, internalizing all the externalities, think about all of its effects and say, what's going to produce the most thriving of the human and non-human life that connects with this system across all metrics of thriving? That's our task.
Wow.
Mind blown.
Yeah.
So we might be reaching the end of our time here, but this brings up another really interesting point of focus for maybe a future episode, is talking about what you guys are doing with Neurohacker Collective and sort of the big picture systems approach you're taking.
The mothership.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have flagged a few follow-up conversations on just this conversation already. So we've got the hard problem of consciousness and existentialism, maybe some deeper stuff about what is good in indigenous wisdom. I think we talked about briefly before the show, what does transhumanism look like in this framework? What is a kind of transhumanism that is optimizing for thriving across all metrics and that understands the complex, complicated distinction, and maybe how we're thinking about all those things and what we're doing with Neurohacker. So it sounds like we have some conversations ahead.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Fantastic.
Cool. Well, let's wrap up there then. Daniel, it's really good to have you on the show. Again, mind's blown. I think we're going to be talking about this for weeks.
Can I offer one more thought about what you all are doing in your show?
Sure.
We have so many more apocalyptic and dystopian visions for our future than we do possibly viable protopic ones. So when you guys, are thinking about and sharing in the show what are positive visions of a future, if we share positive visions of a future that aren't actually tenable, right? They aren't actually anti-fragile in the presence of exponential tech, or they presuppose things that involve going backwards in ways that would never be selected for. Those are useless. But to have more humans visioning what is a viable, thriving civilization aligned with our evolving capacities, what could it look like? I think that's actually one of the most critical things that has to be happening more for humanity to make it and for those positive visions to come about.
Completely agree. There's two sort of key tenets that we have discussed so much in the past, which is behind our thinking about future thinkers, which is you don't create a better future by visualizing the worst case scenario all the time and not thinking of the actual thing that you want.
Yes.
And that works across the board with business, with anything that we've had experience, creating our lifestyles. Like, you can look at our lifestyles and the fact that we've traveled for 5 years and basically done anything on a whim that we've desired to do, because that's the thing we go after. We visualize what would be great, what would improve our lives, then we go after that thing. And then the second thing is not being uncomfortable with discomfort and negative possibilities of the future as well, and actually spending the time to incorporate anti-fragility, like you said, and recovering from negative situations into your plan for the future.
Yeah.
So I think that is, you made that point earlier in the show, and I think that is absolutely huge, and we keep harping on this lately, that you have to, in order to be resilient, you have to actually be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'm delighted to see the direction that the show keeps taking. I'm delighted to be on. I look forward to the next time too.
Cool. Thanks for joining us again. This is always fun.
Thanks, y'all.
So to get the show notes with the links, mentions, books, etc., go to futurethinkers.org/43. And to listen to the first half of this interview, you can go to futurethinkers.org/42.
If you haven't heard our first interview with Daniel about the global phase shift, then go to futurethinkers.org/36. And if you're interested in trying Qualia, the smart drug stack that Daniel's company has developed, go to futurethinkers.org/brainhack. All right, we'll see you in the next episode. Bye!
Bye! Thanks for listening to the Future Thinkers podcast. To get notified of new podcasts and videos, go to futurethinkers.org and subscribe to our mailing list. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube.
If you like what we do and you want to help us make more podcasts and videos, give us a like or a review, share it with your friends, and consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/futurethinkers. If you're looking to get serious about meditation, check out the meditation app that we've created with Vinay Gupta called The Cutting Machinery. Go to cuttingmachinery.org/app.
Last but not least, if you want to get access to more content, hidden episodes, or if you just want to chat with us and previous guests, then check out our community at community.futurethinkers.org.